Most people think strength is loud. They think power announces itself. They think the strongest person in the room is the one who dominates conversations, demands attention, and never backs down. But psychology teaches us something different. Some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are incredibly quiet, and among them is the female empath. A female empath often enters people's lives with understanding, patience, and emotional intelligence. She notices what others miss. She senses discomfort before it's spoken. She gives second chances when most people would walk away. Because of this, many people make a dangerous mistake. They confuse compassion with weakness. They assume that because she forgives, she will always forgive. Because she understands, she will always understand. Because she stays, she will never leave. And that is where the misunderstanding begins. You see, empaths operate differently from most people. They invest emotionally. When they care deeply. When they support someone, they often give far more than they receive. But every human being has a psychological threshold, a point where the mind stops negotiating with pain, a point where the heart realizes that continuing to give is creating self-destruction. When a female empath reaches that point, something remarkable happens. Not dramatic, not explosive, remarkable. The first thing that changes is her attention. People often underestimate the value of attention. Attention is emotional currency. Where attention goes, emotional energy follows. For months or even years, an empath may have invested that energy into someone else. Listening, helping, understanding, encouraging. But once the realization arrives that her efforts are being taken for granted, she begins withdrawing that investment, quietly, strategically. And suddenly, the person who always had access to her no longer does. The second change is even more powerful. She stops explaining. This confuses many people. Because before reaching her limit, she probably explained everything. She explained her feelings. She explained her boundaries. She explained what was hurting her. She explained what needed to change. But after enough repetition, the brain recognizes a pattern. And psychology tells us that when people recognize a pattern that consistently produces disappointment, they eventually stop seeking a different outcome. The empath realizes she has already communicated enough. Nothing new needs to be said. The information was never missing. The effort was. And that's when silence begins replacing explanations. The third transformation is emotional detachment. Many people think detachment happens overnight. It doesn't. It happens gradually, like a bridge being dismantled one piece at a time. Every broken promise removes a plank. Every betrayal removes another. Every act of disrespect weakens the structure, until eventually there is no bridge left. What makes this stage so surprising is that outsiders often don't notice it happening. The female empath may still smile, still be polite, still remain respectful, but internally something has changed. The emotional attachment has already left the room, and once emotional detachment is complete, rebuilding trust becomes incredibly difficult. The fourth change is personal growth. This is where people become truly shocked, because many expect pain to destroy a person. But healthy individuals often use pain as information. The female empath begins investing in herself, her goals, her health, her confidence, her future. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" she begins asking, "What is this experience teaching me?" And that question changes everything. Because growth redirects energy away from suffering and toward development. The person who was once emotionally exhausted becomes emotionally disciplined. The person who was constantly available becomes selectively available. The person who once tolerated disrespect develops standards, and standards change outcomes. The final lesson is perhaps the most important. The greatest mistake someone can make is believing that loyalty has no limit. Every relationship operates on emotional reciprocity. When one person consistently gives while the other consistently takes, imbalance is created. An imbalance cannot survive forever. Eventually, reality corrects itself, not through revenge, not through punishment, but through absence. The female empath simply stops, offering what was never appreciated. And that is often the moment people realize what they lost. Because genuine empathy is rare. Real understanding is rare. Authentic emotional support is rare. The tragedy is that many people only recognize the value of those things after they're gone. So if there's one lesson to take from this, it's simple. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Never mistake patience for permission. And never assume that someone who loves deeply will tolerate being hurt. Forever. Because when a female empath finally chooses herself, the transformation isn't loud. It's quiet. It's powerful. And for those who underestimated her, it's unforgettable. Most people think strength is something obvious, something that demands attention the moment it enters a room. They imagine strength as dominance, control, confidence that never wavers, or a personality so forceful that nobody dares challenge it. But human behavior reveals a different reality. Some of the strongest individuals are often the least noticeable because their power is not built on intimidation, it is built on self-control, emotional awareness, and resilience. A female empath is a perfect example of this hidden form of strength. She is often the person who notices when someone is struggling before they say a word, who senses emotional shifts that others completely miss, and who carries the emotional weight of relationships with remarkable patience. She naturally tries to understand people. Instead of judging them, gives opportunities instead of ultimatums, and offers support even when she receives very little in return. Because of these qualities, many people make a critical psychological error. They interpret her kindness as weakness, her patience as dependence, and her willingness to forgive as proof that she will always stay. What they fail to understand is that empathy is not the absence of strength, it is strength under control. It takes far more emotional discipline to remain compassionate in difficult situations than it does to react with anger. The female empath often sees potential in people long after others have given up on them. She believes that understanding can heal misunderstandings, and that communication can solve many problems. This is why she frequently gives second chances, sometimes even third and fourth chances, hoping that people will eventually recognize the value of what they have. However, every human being has emotional limits, and empathy does not make someone immune to pain. In fact, because empaths invest so deeply in relationships, they often feel emotional wounds more intensely than others. They may tolerate disrespect longer than most people because they keep searching for reasons behind someone's behavior, but tolerance should never be mistaken for acceptance. While others are focused on what the empath continues to give, they rarely notice the emotional cost she is paying in silence. Every disappointment leaves an impression. Every broken promise creates another layer of emotional fatigue. Every moment of being taken for granted slowly changes the way she sees the relationship. Yet these changes are usually invisible because they happen internally. Unlike people who immediately react to conflict, the female empath often processes experiences quietly. She observes patterns, collects information, and reflects deeply before making decisions. This can create the illusion that nothing is wrong when in reality she is carefully evaluating everything. The most important thing to understand is that her strength is rooted in awareness. She notices consistency, effort, honesty, and respect, but she also notices manipulation, selfishness, and emotional neglect. While others may focus only on isolated incidents, she pays attention to patterns. Over time, those patterns reveal the truth about a person's intentions. When that truth becomes impossible to ignore, something significant begins to change within her. She starts realizing that her energy has value, that her compassion is not an unlimited resource, and that continually sacrificing her well-being for people who refuse to appreciate it is not kindness, it is self-neglect. This realization marks the beginning of a powerful transformation. It is not fueled by anger or revenge. It is fueled by clarity. The female empath begins to understand that protecting her peace is just as important as protecting the feelings of others. And once that understanding takes hold, the same person who once gave endlessly becomes someone who finally recognizes her own worth, making her stronger, wiser, and far more powerful than those who ever mistook her kindness for weakness. One of the most misunderstood aspects of a female empath is the depth of her emotional investment. When she forms a connection with someone, she does not approach it casually. She pays attention to details, remembers conversations, notices changes in behavior, and often gives emotional support without expecting recognition in return. This level of care is rare because it requires genuine concern for another person's well-being. Yet many people become so accustomed to receiving this support that they begin to view it as normal rather than valuable. Human psychology has a tendency to take consistent positive experiences for granted, and this often happens in relationships with empaths. The more reliable she becomes, the less some people appreciate the effort behind her actions. They start assuming that her understanding will always be available, regardless of how they treat her. They believe she will continue forgiving disrespect because she has done so before. They assume that because she remains calm during conflict, she is unaffected by what is happening. However, this assumption ignores a crucial reality. Every act of kindness requires energy. Every moment of patience requires emotional effort. Every time she chooses understanding over resentment, she is making a conscious decision that carries a psychological cost. While she may not immediately react to hurtful behavior, she is still observing it. Her mind is constantly collecting information, comparing words to actions, promises to outcomes, and intentions to behavior. Unlike people who make quick emotional decisions, she often takes time to process experiences. She searches for context, tries to understand motivations, and gives others the benefit of the doubt. This is why people are often surprised when her perspective eventually changes. They mistake her silence for ignorance when, in reality, she has noticed everything. She simply chooses reflection before reaction. As patterns of disappointment continue, she begins recognizing that certain behaviors are not accidents but habits. She realizes that some people are not misunderstanding her boundaries, they are ignoring them. She sees that some individuals value what she provides without truly valuing her as a person. This awareness develops gradually, but once it becomes clear, it fundamentally changes the way she views the relationship. What once felt like hope begins to feel like exhaustion. What once felt like loyalty begins to feel like imbalance. And what once felt like patience begins to feel like self-sacrifice. The most important shift occurs when the female empath stops focusing exclusively on the needs of others and starts recognizing her own emotional needs with the same level of importance. This moment is powerful because it represents a change in identity rather than a temporary emotional reaction. For a long time, she may have believed that being a good person meant constantly giving, constantly understanding, and constantly making room for the shortcomings of others. But experience teaches a different lesson. True emotional maturity is not about endless sacrifice, it is about balance. It is about understanding that compassion without boundaries eventually becomes self-neglect. As this realization grows stronger, her decisions begin to change. She becomes more selective with her time, more protective of her energy, and more aware of who genuinely contributes to her life. People who once relied on unlimited access to her support suddenly notice a difference. The conversations become less frequent. The emotional labor she once performed without hesitation is no longer automatically available. This change is not driven by bitterness. It is driven by self-respect. She understands that relationships should involve mutual effort rather than one-sided dependency. Psychologically, this is a significant transformation because it shifts her from a position of emotional overextension to one of emotional balance. She no longer feels responsible for fixing every problem, healing every wound, or carrying every burden that others place on her shoulders. Instead, she begins investing that energy into her own growth, goals, and well-being. The confidence that emerges from this process is different from external confidence. It is quiet, stable, and rooted in self-awareness. She no longer needs validation from people who failed to appreciate her value because she has learned to recognize that value herself. Ironically, this is often the point when others begin to understand what they lost. The emotional support they once considered ordinary is suddenly absent. The patience they relied on is no longer limitless. The understanding they expected is no longer guaranteed. They realize that the person they underestimated was providing far more than they ever acknowledged. Yet by the time this realization arrives, the female empath has already changed. She is no longer seeking approval, explanations, or apologies to define her worth. She has discovered that her greatest strength was never her ability to endure mistreatment, it was her ability to learn from it, grow beyond it, and move forward with greater wisdom, stronger boundaries, and a deeper understanding of her own value. The most powerful and often overlooked stage in the emotional journey of a female empath begins when she quietly starts detaching from what no longer serves her well-being. This is not an instant reaction or an emotional outburst, it is a slow and deeply internal process that happens beneath the surface. To the outside world, she may still appear the same. She still speaks politely, still responds when necessary, and still carries herself with calmness. Internally, her emotional system has already begun to shift. She is no longer investing the same level of energy into people who repeatedly disregard her feelings. Instead of reacting to every situation, she begins to observe more than she participates. This change often goes unnoticed because empaths are naturally composed even during emotional distress. However, psychology shows that emotional withdrawal is one of the strongest indicators of internal boundary formation. As she starts to recognize repeated patterns of neglect, inconsistency, or lack of appreciation, her mind begins categorizing experiences differently. What once felt like misunderstanding now feels like a pattern. What once felt like a mistake now feels like intention. And what once felt like hope begins to feel like emotional exhaustion. This shift is crucial because it marks the point where emotional dependence is replaced by emotional awareness. She is no longer reacting based on feelings alone, she is analyzing based on patterns. Over time, she begins to understand that constantly explaining her feelings to people who are not willing to change creates more harm than healing. So she stops over-explaining. She stops over-justifying, and she stops repeating herself in situations where her voice has already been ignored multiple times. This silence is not weakness, it is cognitive clarity. Her mind recognizes that effort without reciprocity leads to emotional depletion. As she withdraws her emotional availability, others may initially assume she is simply upset or temporarily distant. But in reality, she is recalibrating her entire emotional structure. She is learning that peace is not found in how much she gives, but in how much she protects her own inner stability. As this emotional detachment continues, a deeper transformation begins to take place within her psychology. She starts to reclaim control over her attention, which is one of the most valuable forms of emotional energy a person possesses. Where attention goes, emotional investment follows, and for a long time, her attention may have been directed toward understanding, fixing, or supporting people who offered little in return. But now, that focus begins to shift inward. She starts paying attention to her own needs, her own goals, and her own emotional well-being. This is where the imbalance in past relationships becomes clearly visible to her. She realizes how much of herself she gave away without receiving equal emotional respect or care. This realization is not driven by anger but by awareness. It is the kind of understanding that does not need emotional intensity to be powerful. Instead, it creates calm clarity. She begins to set internal standards that were previously absent or ignored. These standards are not about punishing others, they are about protecting herself from repeating cycles of emotional depletion. People who once had unlimited access to her time and energy begin to notice subtle changes. She responds less quickly, engages less deeply, and no longer feels obligated to carry emotional responsibility that does not belong to her. This shift confuses those who were accustomed to her constant availability. However, from her perspective, this is not withdrawal from relationships entirely, it is withdrawal from imbalance. She is learning that healthy connections require mutual effort, not one-sided emotional labor. As her awareness deepens, she begins to understand that her value was never dependent on how much she endured or how much she tolerated. Her value exists in her presence, her insight, her loyalty, and her emotional intelligence, but only in environments where these qualities are respected. This is where personal growth begins to replace emotional exhaustion. She no longer defines herself through the lens of what others demand from her, but through what she chooses to allow in her life. Eventually, this transformation leads to a complete restructuring of her identity and emotional boundaries. The person who once prioritized understanding everyone else's pain at the cost of her own begins to prioritize balance, self-respect, and emotional sustainability. This does not mean she becomes cold or uncaring, rather, she becomes intentional. Her empathy does not disappear, it becomes disciplined. She still understands people deeply, but she no longer allows that understanding to override her own well-being. This is a critical psychological shift because it separates compassion from self-sacrifice. She learns that she can care about others without carrying their emotional burdens as her own responsibility. As a result, her presence becomes more grounded and stable. She no longer enters relationships with unlimited emotional availability. Instead, she engages with awareness of boundaries and mutual respect. People who once underestimated her may begin to feel her absence more than her presence, not because she changed into someone different, but because she stopped overextending herself. The emotional space she once filled effortlessly is no longer freely available. This often leads to reflection from others, but by this stage, she is no longer seeking validation or recognition for what she used to give. She has already processed that lesson internally. The most significant outcome of this transformation is self-possession. She no longer operates from emotional dependency or the need to be understood by those who failed to value her consistently. Instead, she operates from clarity, stability, and self-awareness. Her strength is no longer in how much she can endure, but in how effectively she can choose what she allows into her life. And in that quiet decision, she becomes far more powerful than anyone who ever mistook her kindness for weakness. When people underestimate a female empath, they usually do it for one simple reason. They misunderstand the nature of her patience. They see her ability to stay calm and emotionally intense situations and assume it means she is unaffected. They see her willingness to listen without interruption and assume it means she has no boundaries. They see her forgiveness and assume it means there are no consequences for repeated behavior. But psychologically, this interpretation is incomplete. A female empath does not lack awareness, she often has more awareness than the people around her. She notices inconsistencies between words and actions, emotional shifts in tone, and patterns of behavior that others ignore. However, she often chooses to respond with understanding rather than immediate rejection. This creates a false impression that she will always remain in the same emotional position regardless of how she is treated. What people fail to realize is that her patience is not infinite, it is conditional. It is based on observation, not ignorance. Every interaction she experiences is stored mentally as part of a larger emotional pattern. While she may not confront every issue directly, she is always processing information internally. This is where many misunderstand her nature. They think silence means acceptance, when in reality, silence often means analysis. She is not reacting immediately because she is evaluating whether a situation is worth her emotional energy. Over time, this internal evaluation becomes more refined. She begins to separate emotional noise from emotional truth. And once she clearly identifies a pattern of disrespect, neglect, or imbalance, her perception of the relationship begins to change permanently. As this awareness develops, the emotional investment she once freely gave starts to decrease. Not because she stops caring, but because she starts understanding the cost of caring without reciprocity. A female empath often gives far more emotional energy than she receives, especially in relationships where she is deeply invested. She listens when others need to be heard, she supports when others feel weak, and she encourages when others are uncertain. But when these actions are not matched with equal emotional respect, a slow internal shift begins. She starts recognizing that her emotional labor is not being valued at the same level it is being offered. This realization does not happen suddenly, it builds gradually through repeated experiences of disappointment. At first, she may try to explain more, help more, or understand more, believing that better communication can fix the imbalance. However, when effort continues to go unacknowledged, she begins to adjust her behavior. She stops overextending herself emotionally. She stops trying to fix situations that are not improving. And she stops investing energy into conversations that lead nowhere. This is not emotional coldness, it is psychological adaptation. Her mind is protecting itself from continued emotional exhaustion. People around her may not immediately notice this shift because it happens quietly. She does not announce her withdrawal. She simply begins participating less in emotional dynamics that drain her. This is often the stage where others start to feel her absence, even if she is still physically present. The emotional connection that once felt effortless begins to weaken because the energy that sustained it is no longer being supplied at the same level. Eventually, the transformation becomes more visible in her behavior, although it still remains controlled and composed. She becomes more selective with her attention, and more conscious of where she invests her emotional energy. Situations that once triggered emotional engagement now receive measured responses. Conversations that once required deep involvement are now approached with distance and clarity. This is not detachment from empathy itself, it is detachment from imbalance. She still understands people deeply, but she no longer allows that understanding to override her own emotional boundaries. This shift is significant because it marks the transition from emotional overextension to emotional self-regulation. She begins to prioritize her peace over her tendency to fix or carry the emotional weight of others. This change often surprises people who are accustomed to her constant availability. They may interpret it as sudden distance, but in reality, it is the result of long-term emotional accumulation finally reaching its limit. Every unappreciated effort, every ignored boundary, and every moment of emotional neglect contributes to this internal decision. Once this threshold is crossed, she no longer operates from the assumption that people will eventually change. She operates from the understanding of how they have already behaved. This clarity removes emotional confusion and replaces it with stability. She is no longer reacting to potential, she is responding to reality. In the final stage of this psychological shift, the female empath undergoes a deeper form of self-realization. She begins to understand that her value was never dependent on how much she endured or how much she gave to others. Instead, her value exists independently of what she sacrifices. This realization is powerful because it redefines her identity away from emotional over-responsibility. She stops measuring her worth through the lens of how much others need her and starts measuring it through how well she respects her own emotional limits. This is where true transformation happens, not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity. She no longer seeks validation from people who failed to recognize her effort. She no longer feels obligated to explain her boundaries repeatedly. And she no longer confuses emotional exhaustion with loyalty. Instead, she builds a life where her empathy is guided by choice, not pressure. She still cares, but she cares wisely. She still understands others, but she does not lose herself in that understanding. This balance makes her stronger than before because it combines emotional intelligence with self-respect. And once a female empath reaches this stage, she is no longer the person people once underestimated. She becomes someone who understands her own worth so clearly that she no longer needs anyone else to define it for her.